The Flame Queen, Part 1. Chapter 1, A Song Beneath the Ashen Sky. The rain fell in sheets over the city of Nocturne, each drop hissing as it met the slick stone streets, the scent of wet iron rising from the cobblestones like a memory that refused to be buried. Neon signs buzzed and flickered weakly behind dust-streaked windows, casting ghostly reflections into puddles blacker than ink, and somewhere down an alley where the moon refused to shine, a song was dying in the dark. Eva Moreau stepped onto the makeshift stage of the Crimson Glass for the fifth night. In a row, her heels echoing on worn floorboards, her breath a plume in the frigid air, and her voice, when it came, slipped through the room like smoke curling through candlelight, low and aching and full of the kind of sadness that stuck to the ribs. The patrons barely looked up, eyes sunken, minds dulled by cheap wine and dreams they'd already mortgaged to survive. But in the farthest corner, where the shadows coiled thickest and the crimson velvet no longer bled color, a man listened, still as death, his gaze sharp as broken glass and colder than the grave. Eva felt it like a touch to the throat, invisible fingers tracing the outline of her pulse. Her voice faltered for half a breath, then found its footing, smoother, darker, laced now with something unspeakable, something summoned, as if the song itself had reached into her chest and pulled out a secret she'd never meant to give. She didn't know his name, not yet, only that he'd been coming every night for a week, always in black, always watching, never drinking, never blinking, like a portrait that hadn't gotten the message it wasn't real. And when the final note of her song slipped into silence, the moment held, stretched, shivered, then broke as light applause clattered awkwardly through the bar. Eva bowed with practiced grace, smiled tight, and ducked behind the curtain into the suffocating warmth of backstage, her fingers trembling as she reached for the flask hidden in her coat pocket. She hadn't seen him rise, hadn't heard footsteps, but she felt him there before she turned, before the curtain shifted, before the temperature dropped like a corpse into a lake. "You sing like you've bled for it," the man said, voice like velvet soaked in smoke. She turned slowly, heart hammering in her throat, and found him standing impossibly close, his coat dripping shadows more than rain, eyes like fractured onyx lit from within. "Do I know you?" she asked, trying to keep her tone level, uninterested, but it came out like a prayer to a god she didn't believe in. "Not yet," he said, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "But I know what you are." Eva's breath caught, her mind flashing to the old stories her mother used to whisper, the ones she'd laughed at, buried, burned, but something in the way he looked at her stripped her of every lie she'd told herself to survive. "You're mistaken," she said, but he only tilted his head, as if studying a painting too complex to name. "You've been dreaming of fire," he murmured, "of blood," and though she tried to deny it, her silence betrayed her. Outside, thunder rumbled like a beast waking in its cage, and Eva realized, whatever this man was, whatever he wanted, he hadn't come for her music, he'd come for what was in her blood. And the city, this dead, drowning city, was about to remember that monsters didn't always wait in the dark. Sometimes they walked straight through the front door and asked for a name. Chapter 2, The Man with Blood in His Eyes. The rain had stopped, but the silence it left behind was louder than any storm, thick with tension, as if the city itself had drawn in a breath and refused to let it go. The puddles in the alley reflected the muted red of the crimson glass's sign like a bleeding wound, flickering in time with Eva's pulse as she stepped out into the narrow street behind the club, her coat pulled tight around her but doing little to guard against the cold that clung to her bones like a second skin. She couldn't shake the memory of his voice, the way he had said her name without ever speaking it, the way his eyes had caught the light and held it hostage, like he could see through her skin, through her flesh, through every wall she had spent a lifetime building. She shouldn't have followed him out, shouldn't have left the dim safety of the bar, but something in her feet had moved before her mind could protest, like the music was still inside her, echoing in the empty rhythm of her steps. And he was there, of course he was, waiting just beyond the reach of the light, leaning against the crumbling brick like he belonged to the shadows, the collar of his coat turned up, his expression unreadable but no less sharp, no less dangerous. The air around him felt thinner, like it had to work harder just to exist in his presence. Eva stopped a few feet away, every instinct screaming for her to turn back, to forget this, to forget him, but curiosity dug in its claws and refused to let go. "Who are you?" she asked, and he stepped forward, just once, enough to bring his face into the light, to let her see that he wasn't handsome in any traditional way, not soft, not charming, but striking, magnetic, like a blade catching the moonlight before it cut. "I've gone by many names," he said, voice low and smooth like warm whiskey, "but the one they cursed me with first was Dorian." She didn't recognize it, didn't know if she should. But something in the way he said it made it feel like a name that had echoed through time, carved into tombstones and whispered in dying breaths. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice a little too steady, and he smiled, slow and deliberate, like a wolf deciding if it wanted to play with its food. "Not what you think," he said, "and not yet." He reached into his coat and pulled something out, something wrapped in silk the color of dried blood. He offered it to her, no force, no pressure, just his hand outstretched like a question she couldn't refuse. She hesitated, then took it, the fabric soft beneath her fingers, but whatever was inside felt cold and solid and old. "What is this?" she asked. "A key," he said, "to something you've been locked out of your entire life." And then, without another word, he turned and walked into the darkness, his silhouette dissolving into the mist like smoke through broken glass. Eva stood there long after he vanished, staring at the wrapped object in her hand like it might catch fire, like it might whisper secrets if she listened hard enough. She had no idea who he truly was or what game she had just been pulled into, but she could feel it now, humming at the edges of her blood, something waking, something ancient, something that had always been there, waiting beneath her skin. And as she turned and walked back toward the club, the neon light flickering out behind her like the closing of a lid, she didn't see the figure watching from the rooftop above, eyes burning like coals, lips murmuring her name like a curse and a prayer. And far below the city streets, something stirred in its slumber, tasting her scent in the air, and smiling. Chapter 3: The Covenant burns slowly. The key was heavier than it should have been, not in weight but in presence. It throbbed with something ancient and unspoken, something buried deep beneath words and reason, and Eva couldn't bring herself to unwrap it. Not yet. It remained sealed in its blood-colored silk, tucked in the drawer beside her bed like a secret trying to stay asleep. But even behind wood and fabric it called to her, pulsing in rhythm with the dreams that had begun to devour her sleep, dreams that came in flashes of fire and teeth and voices whispering in a language her waking mind couldn't understand. Sometimes she woke with the taste of iron on her tongue, other times with the memory of wings unfolding over a dark city skyline, not bird wings, not angelic, but jagged and black as coal, breathing shadow. And always there were eyes, watching, endless and familiar, and always there was music, faint and sorrowful, like a lullaby sung at the edge of a grave. She stopped going to the crimson glass, stopped answering calls. The world outside narrowed to the boundaries of her small, dim apartment, where curtains stayed drawn and time slowed to a crawl. She would sit for hours just staring at that drawer, heart pounding, breath shallow, trying to understand why the sight of a man in the shadows and the sound of her name in his voice had turned her world inside out. And it wasn't until the third night that she finally broke, pulled the drawer open with shaking hands and unwrapped the silk, revealing not a key in the traditional sense but a pendant shaped like an eye, obsidian and crimson, set in tarnished silver, carved with runes that shifted when she tried to focus on them, as if the pendant didn't want to be understood, didn't want to be seen. The moment she touched it with bare skin, the air in the room dropped 10 degrees, the lights flickered, and for the briefest instant she saw herself, not in the mirror, not in reflection, but standing across the room, watching with eyes that weren't entirely her own. And then it was gone, the moment snapped shut like a mousetrap, and she was alone again, breath ragged, skin damp, heart pounding like it was trying to claw its way out. She should have thrown it out the window, down the drain, into the sea, but instead she put it around her neck, not out of bravery, not out of trust, but out of something deeper, something that whispered this had always been meant for her, that the song she'd sung at the crimson glass was never just hers. It had come from a place she'd never known until now. And once the pendant was around her neck, the dreams stopped being dreams, they became memories, not hers, not fully, but real, visceral, vivid. She saw the covenant for the first time, not in text or tale but in blood, in fire, in chained bodies whispering names to the dark as their minds broke. She saw vampires bound not by hunger but by law, By a decree older than empires, a pact etched into the bones of the First Court. Ruled by a queen with lips like knives and a voice made of ash, Countess Nyxeria, her name pulsed in Eva's skull like thunder under skin, and suddenly she understood what Dorian had meant when he said she was locked out of something, because the pendant had just unlocked a door in her mind that she couldn't shut. She tried to tell herself it wasn't real, that the visions were stress, paranoia, maybe some elaborate game played by a stranger who wanted to frighten her, but deep down she knew better, because part of her hadn't just recognized Nyxeria in those visions, part of her had remembered her, the scent of her perfume like crushed roses and rain, the way she looked down from her throne of carved obsidian and spoke Eva's true name, not the one given to her at birth but the one buried so deep even she had forgotten it, and that name sang in her blood now, waking something that should have stayed sleeping. And somewhere in the depths of Nocturne, Dorian stood in a cathedral of broken stone beneath the city, watching candles flicker around an empty sarcophagus, whispering the same name over and over, a name that, when spoken too often, made the stone weep blood and the rats flee in silence, because the covenant was burning, not with fire but with truth, slow and irreversible, and Eva Moreau was no longer just a singer with secrets, she was a spark, and someone, something, was waiting for her to ignite. Chapter 4, What Sleeps Beneath Nocturne. The cathedral beneath Nocturne was not on any map, not in any book, not even in the fragmented memories of the city's oldest immortals. It was buried so deep that even time itself had forgotten how to count the centuries since its doors were last opened, and yet Dorian stood within it now, motionless beneath the sweeping stone arches that bent like the ribs of some long-dead leviathan, the flickering candlelight barely touching the shadows that pooled in the corners of the ancient chamber. The floor was tiled with shattered glass and black marble, each step he took whispering with voices that were not his own. The walls breathed, not with air but with the lingering echoes of rituals once performed in blood, and at the center of it all, resting atop a dais carved from the bones of extinct beasts, was the sarcophagus that no vampire dared to speak of, not in whispers, not even in nightmares. It was sealed with 7 locks, each forged from an oath broken by blood. And Dorian had broken 3 of them already, not by choice, never by choice, but because the world had begun to move again and time, once frozen, was now trickling like crimson sap through old wounds. He stared at the coffin, jaw clenched, heart silent in his chest, not from lack of emotion but from the curse that had long since stripped it of its beat. His was a stillness learned from centuries of servitude, of silence, of watching, of waiting for a moment that might never come, but now she was waking, and the moment had come faster than even the old ones had feared. Eva Moreau, the name rolled through his thoughts like smoke, like a spell, like a blade dragged slow across stone. He had known it the moment he saw her on that stage, the moment her voice curled through the air like a thread pulled from the tapestry of fate itself. She had sung like she'd bled in another life, and he had felt the resonance of something ancient shift beneath his skin, something not his. Something that did not belong to this time, or this city, or this war, but to the blood that pulsed through her veins like a song only monsters remembered. He turned from the sarcophagus and walked to the altar behind it, where the remnants of the old language were still etched into stone, crooked symbols that bled if you stared at them too long, words that tasted like ash when spoken aloud. And as he placed his hand on the center of the sigil, the candles flared, not brighter, but deeper. Shadows thickening like oil as the flame bent in submission, and the veil between then and now grew thinner. He closed his eyes and let the memory take him, not his memory, never his, but hers, hers from a time she had not lived but had survived, when the world still remembered the first covenant, when the vampire courts were not courts at all but cults hiding behind silk and silver, when Nyxeria rose from the crimson throne and carved her rule into the flesh of those who dared defy her. He saw Eva as she was then, not Eva but someone else, her eyes hollow from magic, her hands stained with spellcraft and sorrow, her voice commanding even as she screamed, and he watched as Nyxeria placed the pendant around her throat like a chain, sealing her fate, binding her power, and whispering the name that no longer existed in the tongues of men. When Dorian opened his eyes, the sigil had gone dark, the stone beneath his hand cracked, the air smelled of burnt roses and blood, and he knew. She had touched the pendant, had seen the door inside her mind begin to open. The seals were breaking, not just on the sarcophagus but on the memory of what had been done, and if she remembered too quickly, too fully, there would be no time to prepare her for what waited at the end of this spiral, because Eva was not simply a girl with a voice and a bloodline, she was a key, a weapon, a myth wrapped in flesh. And if she stepped into her truth before she understood its cost, the covenant would not simply break. It would shatter, unleashing something the vampire courts had buried so deep they had forgotten to fear it, something that slept even now beneath the stone and sorrow of Nocturne, its breath coiled around the bones of traitors, its hunger older than empires, and if it woke before Dorian could bind her fate to his, then not even Countess Nyxeria, with all her cunning and cruelty, would be able to stop what was coming. He stepped back from the altar, cloak trailing behind him like a wound, and disappeared into the deeper catacombs, where secrets were stored in bone and silence, because he needed more time, and Eva Moreau was already running out of it. Chapter 5: A Room Full of Mirrors. The pendant was burning against her skin, not with fire but with a pulse, a rhythm, a heartbeat that wasn't hers but somehow belonged inside her chest. It had been growing stronger since dawn, thrumming through her bones, echoing in her blood like the bass of a song only she could hear, the kind that vibrated in your ribcage and made your teeth ache. Eva paced her apartment like a caged thing, eyes darting to the mirror over the fireplace every few steps. It had begun acting strangely too. Flickering, distorting, showing her things she couldn't explain and didn't want to see, eyes that weren't hers blinking back from her reflection, cracks that spiderwebbed across the glass even though it was still whole, shadows moving in the corners when there was nothing to cast them, and then there were the voices, faint at first, like whispers through a closed door, but now louder, clearer, murmuring in languages she didn't know but somehow understood, chanting fragments of names. Broken phrases, weeping hymns that made her stomach twist and her eyes burn. She had stopped answering calls from the club, stopped responding to the pounding on her door from the manager threatening to cut her loose. She couldn't focus on music, couldn't focus on anything except the way the world had begun to bend, just slightly, like reality had slipped a fraction out of alignment. And at the center of it all was this pendant and the man who had given it to her and disappeared into the rain. Like he was never meant to be touched by light, Dorian, his name lingered in her mind like smoke, and no matter how she tried to distract herself, she kept remembering the way he'd looked at her, not like a stranger, not even like a predator, but like someone remembering something long buried, like someone seeing a ghost that shouldn't be walking, and the worst part was that somewhere deep inside, she had looked at him the same way, like she had known him once, not in this life but in a story that ended badly. She stopped pacing and stood in front of the mirror again, staring at her reflection, forcing herself to meet her own eyes, trying to find the girl she used to be, the one who sang in smoke-filled bars and didn't believe in monsters, but all she saw now was a stranger with a secret, a woman whose skin didn't quite fit right anymore, and as she leaned closer, the lights flickered, and for a split second her reflection didn't move with her, didn't mirror her, it just stood there, still, watching. With pupils too dark and a mouth that didn't smile, and then it snapped back into place, her reflection mimicking her again, perfectly, but the damage was done. Something was wrong, not just around her but inside her. Something was waking up and it wasn't asking permission, it was clawing its way through centuries of silence, and she couldn't fight it, not when it was made of her. She backed away, heart slamming against her ribs, and that was when she heard it, footsteps outside her apartment. Slow, deliberate. Too heavy to be human, too confident to be afraid. She didn't breathe, didn't blink, just listened as they stopped directly outside her door. A pause, then a knock, not loud, not urgent, but final. She moved toward the door with her fingers trembling, blood humming like wires sparking beneath her skin, and before she could decide if she was brave or just out of time, she opened it, and standing there wasn't Dorian, but a woman, tall, pale, dressed in crimson velvet that shimmered like wet blood. Her eyes a cold, impossible shade of violet, her mouth painted with something darker than lipstick, something that gleamed like oil and poison. "Eva Moreau," she said, voice like silk wrapped around a knife, "we need to talk." Eva didn't move, didn't speak, couldn't, because the woman's presence filled the hallway like smoke, like the perfume of rotting roses, like gravity had shifted around her. "Who are you?" she managed to ask. The words dry in her throat, and the woman smiled, slow and cruel. A friend, she said. Or an enemy, depending on how much you've remembered, and before Eva could respond, the woman stepped forward, uninvited but unstoppable, and the pendant around Eva's neck pulsed once, hard, as if recognizing her, as if afraid. Countess Nyxaria sends her regards, the woman said softly, and the name hit Eva like a thunderclap behind her eyes, a wave of memories and pain and light exploding through her skull. And the last thing she saw before the world went black was her own reflection in the mirror behind the woman, smiling when she was not. Chapter 6, The Violet-Eyed Stranger. Darkness didn't fall, it slammed into her, sudden and suffocating, not like sleep, not like passing out, but like falling into water with no surface to break for air. Time had no shape in that place, no form, no heartbeat, only flashes of memory that weren't hers, or weren't just hers, fire curling along the edges of vision, a city burning beneath twin moons, voices screaming names lost to history, and through it all, the pulse of the pendant pressed against her chest, a steady beat that didn't fade, didn't fail, as if it were anchoring her in this storm of echoes. When Eva woke, her mouth tasted of ash and iron, her skin was slick with cold sweat, and the lights in her apartment had gone out completely, every bulb shattered, every candle extinguished. The silence was dense and absolute, broken only by the sound of her own breathing, ragged and uneven, and the soft, unmistakable click of a lighter being flicked to life in the dark. The flame danced, small and hungry, illuminating the figure now seated in her favorite chair as though she'd always belonged there, the woman from the doorway, violet eyes glowing faintly, one leg crossed over the other like she was waiting for tea, the velvet of her dress pooling around her like a spill of fresh blood. You fainted, she said casually, as if this were a social call, as if Eva hadn't just been dragged into a void of stolen memories. I don't blame you. The first time is always disorienting. Eva struggled to sit up, her limbs slow to obey, her mind still spinning. What did you do to me? She managed, a voice raw and cracked, and the woman's smile returned, cold and knowing. I merely opened the door, she replied. It's not my fault you weren't ready to walk through it. She stood then, graceful and controlled, every movement deliberate, like a serpent deciding whether to strike or coil, and stepped closer, the candlelight revealing more now. Her features ageless, skin like porcelain left out in the moonlight. Beautiful in the way that made your throat close, in the way that reminded you beauty could be a weapon. Who are you? Eva demanded, pushing herself fully upright, fighting the tremble in her hands. Tell me the truth. The woman cocked her head, amused. Truth, she repeated softly, as though that word has any meaning left in this city. She walked to the mirror, the one that had been watching Eva for days, and traced her fingers along the glass, which now rippled like water under her touch, revealing not a reflection, but a window, a vision of another place, Gothic spires rising from mist-choked streets. Torchlight flickering in windows high above, and at the center of it all, a throne room carved from obsidian, where shadows knelt before a figure draped in darkness, eyes like burning stars staring back through the mirror. You've seen her, haven't you? The woman asked. You've heard her name in your dreams. Eva swallowed, her mouth dry, her heart pounding. Countess Nyxaria, she whispered. And the mirror pulsed with light at the sound, the image within sharpening, the throne and its queen suddenly clearer, closer. She is more than a myth, the woman said, voice reverent, almost afraid. She is the first and the last, the blood that binds, the covenant's architect and its executioner. She turned back to Eva then, expression sobering. And she has taken interest in you. Eva shook her head, fear and fury colliding behind her ribs. Why? She asked. I'm no one, just a singer in a bar, just a liar. The woman cut her off, not cruelly but firmly, like correcting a child who had dared to speak when they should have listened. You are the bloodline buried, the song silenced, the memory rewritten. She walked back toward Eva, kneeling beside her now, her voice lowering to something just above a whisper. You are what the court feared, what they killed to forget. Eva's breath hitched, a dozen questions fighting for dominance. But one rose above the others, bitter and sharp. What do you want from me? The woman reached into her sleeve and pulled out a small object, an earring, simple in design but pulsing with the same red glow as the pendant, I want to help you remember, she said, because soon you'll be asked to choose, and if you don't know who you are before then, someone else will decide for you. She placed the earring in Eva's palm, closed her fingers around it, and stood, her silhouette tall against the dying candlelight. There are others who would see. You used, twisted into a blade for someone else's war. She walked toward the door, pausing only once. My name is Elira, and I serve no throne, and then she was gone, the door clicking shut behind her like the end of a chapter written in a language Eva hadn't yet learned to read, and in the silence that followed, Eva sat alone in the ruins of her safe little world, an earring in her hand, a pendant around her neck, and a mirror that no longer showed her face, but something deeper, something darker. Something that watched and waited with infinite patience for her to remember what it once meant to wear that face, and what price had been paid to forget it. Chapter 7, The Memory Below the Skin. The apartment felt wrong now, not just haunted, not just touched by darkness, but fundamentally altered, as though the reality Eva had lived in had been peeled back to reveal a deeper, older layer that had always been there, waiting just beneath the wallpaper and the paint and the lies. The mirror no longer reflected anything of this world. It rippled occasionally, as if breathing, and each time she passed it, she felt it watching her with quiet hunger, like a beast waiting for her to lower her guard. The pendant and the earring sat together on the coffee table, humming in unison, twin heartbeats out of time with her own, pulsing with a rhythm she couldn't ignore. She hadn't dared put the earring on yet, not after what the pendant had done, not after the mirror started showing her things that couldn't be unseen, but she knew she would, eventually, because that's what all of this was, a slow seduction into truth, a peeling away of the comfort of ignorance. She spent the next day drifting through memories that didn't belong to her, sometimes seeing flashes when she blinked, sometimes losing minutes or hours staring into nothing while entire lifetimes unfolded behind her eyes. Faces she didn't know filled her mind, warriors in dark armor, queens with eyes like molten gold, a child singing in a language made of light, and always, always, the image of a black crown dipped in blood, sitting on a throne that pulsed like it was alive. She saw Dorian again in these visions, but not as he was now. This Dorian wore silver armor, his eyes glowing red with fury, his hands drenched in someone else's blood, standing before her not as a stranger but as something far more intimate, and when he looked at her in that memory, it made her heart ache in a way she didn't understand, as if something had been torn from her once and never given back. She was afraid to sleep, afraid of what her dreams would reveal, but her body eventually betrayed her, dragging her into slumber despite the dread, and in that sleep she found herself walking a corridor of mirrors, endless and narrow, the reflections all wrong, some older, some younger, some twisted and inhuman, all of them watching her, some whispering, some weeping, some smiling with teeth too sharp to be kind, and at the end of the hall stood a door she had never seen before but instantly recognized, black wood etched with runes that pulsed with light like veins beneath skin, and as she reached for the handle, a voice spoke behind her, sharp and low and broken by time. You were never meant to wake. She turned and saw her reflection standing there, no longer bound by glass, wearing her face but not her eyes, not her soul, and it raised a hand, palm outward, as if to push her back, but Eva's fingers were already on the door, and when she opened it, the world shattered. She awoke with a scream caught in her throat, her body slick with sweat, heart hammering, and the apartment reeking of smoke and ozone. The air, charged like lightning, had struck somewhere close, and there, on the table, the earring pulsed brighter, brighter than it ever had, brighter than the pendant, as if answering something awakened within her, and before she could stop herself, her hand reached for it, and she slipped it through her ear, and the moment it clicked into place, the world tilted, colors deepened, shadows grew teeth, and the air tasted like ash and violets and rain. Her heartbeat slowed, then doubled, then steadied, but it wasn't just her heartbeat anymore, it was layered now, folded with something older, something that had been asleep inside her, and with it came understanding, not full, not yet, but enough to know that Dorian hadn't chosen her by chance, that the Countess hadn't whispered her name out of curiosity, that the woman called Elira wasn't a warning but a key, and that the war she'd stumbled into had already been lost once, long ago, and now it was starting again. Only this time the battlefield wasn't in the shadows, it was in her blood, her name, her past, her soul, and outside her apartment, perched on a rooftop with his coat soaked in midnight, Dorian watched her window and felt the shift, the awakening, and whispered into the night, "She's remembering," while far beneath the streets, in a crypt lined with forgotten names, a withered hand twitched inside a sealed coffin, and the sigils that had held it still for centuries cracked in unison, glowing red with anticipation. Chapter 8: The Red Letter and the Broken Crown. The morning came in shades of gray, heavy clouds pressing against the city like a warning that even the sky had grown tired of watching Nocturne rot. The light that filtered through Eva's window was dim and cold, casting long shadows across the apartment that didn't match her furniture, as though things had shifted during the night, as though the walls had breathed in while she slept, shrinking her world into something smaller, tighter, more haunted. She sat at the edge of her bed with her elbows on her knees and her fingers tangled in her hair, the earring still pulsing faintly at her temple like a second heartbeat, the pendant resting against her chest now warm and steady, a rhythmic echo in time with the strange silence that filled the air, not quiet exactly, but something deeper, like a city holding its breath. She had slept, if it could be called that, her dreams no longer dreams but doorways, each one opening to memories that bled into each other, her hand reaching out to a book bound in skin, voices chanting in rooms lit only by fire, her mouth whispering words she didn't know but somehow believed, and in all of them, the same presence lingered, just out of reach, eyes watching her from behind veils of smoke, and now, awake, she could still feel it, a tether running from her spine to something deeper, something below, and it was pulling, not violently but insistently, like a thread snagged on something ancient. She stood and crossed the room to the small table by her door where the newspaper was sometimes slid through the mail slot, and today, improbably, impossibly, there was a letter instead, crimson red and sealed with wax blacker than coal. The seal itself was unfamiliar but felt undeniable, an emblem shaped like a thorned crown encircling a sun half swallowed by shadow. She stared at it for a long moment, then picked it up with trembling fingers. The wax cracked beneath her thumb, and inside was a single piece of parchment, smooth and pale, the writing delicate and curved like it had been etched in blood by candlelight. "You are requested," it read, "at the House of the Broken Crown, midnight. No guards. No blades. Bring what you are." It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be, because the name was already burning through her mind like wildfire. Nyxaria, the Countess herself, the Queen of Whispers, the blood mother of the court, had summoned her, not captured, not hunted, but summoned, as if Eva were something meant to be claimed, something long lost and finally recovered. Her first instinct was to run, to burn the letter, to lock every door and scream until the city swallowed her whole. But another part of her, the part that had started to wake, the part that had seen blood on stone and flames behind the throne, told her this was only the beginning, that she could no more escape this than she could outrun her own skin. She turned away from the table and froze when she saw her reflection in the hallway mirror, only it wasn't her reflection anymore, it was her face, yes, her hair, her eyes, but not the same expression, not the same posture. The woman in the glass stood taller, colder, wearing robes the color of wine and ash, her lips painted with something dark and ancient, and when Eva moved, the reflection didn't, it simply stared, then whispered, so softly she almost missed it, "Midnight," and then it was gone, replaced by her real reflection, pale and wide-eyed and shaking. She dressed without thinking, layers of black, soft and silent, pulled her hair back with trembling hands, slipped the pendant beneath her collar and the earring into place, and when she stepped outside, the city felt different, the streets more narrow, the shadows deeper, even the air thicker, and as she walked, she noticed eyes watching her from windows high above, heard the shuffle of boots in alleys that grew silent as she passed. The House of the Broken Crown wasn't on any map, but her feet knew the way, drawn by something older than memory, and when she arrived at a rusted gate tucked between two crumbling buildings, it opened without her touching it. And the courtyard beyond was filled with statues whose faces were covered in gold veils, their hands held out in eternal silence. Inside, the halls smelled of old books and fresh blood, of candle wax and secrets, and at the center of it all stood a grand chamber where crimson drapes fell like rivers from the ceiling and the marble floor was veined with silver, and on a dais that pulsed like a heartbeat sat Countess Nyxeria, her dress a storm of black and red, her hair a crown of shadows, her smile both cruel and familiar. "You've come," she said, her voice like perfume soaked in venom. "Good," and the room closed in around Eva like a coffin of silk and stone as Nyxeria rose to her feet and the doors sealed behind her with the sound of a blade being drawn, and Eva understood, without being told, that she was not a guest here, not yet. She was a question being weighed, a truth being measured, and the price of answering wrong would not be death, but awakening. Chapter 9, The Queen of Red Silence. Countess Nyxeria descended the steps of her obsidian throne with the grace of a creature that did not walk so much as glide, the long folds of her gown trailing behind her like spilled ink, her gaze fixed on Eva with such intensity it felt less like being looked at and more like being read, dissected, peeled back layer by layer until there was nothing left but truth. Eva stood motionless, every nerve in her body lit with warning, with reverence, with something that felt dangerously close to awe. The air in the grand chamber was thick, perfumed with something floral and faintly metallic, the scent of roses dipped in blood, and the floor beneath her feet gleamed as if recently polished with bone dust. Torches flickered in wall sconces carved with coiling serpents and weeping angels, casting dancing shadows that whispered along the stone. Nyxeria's voice, when it came, was both gentle and terrible, silk laced with razors. "A lullaby for dying stars, you wear the pendant," she said, her lips barely moving, yet the words echoed off the vaulted ceiling like thunder in a cathedral. Eva nodded slowly, unable to find her voice, her thoughts racing, her instincts telling her to bow, to kneel, to run, all at once. "Do you know what it means?" Nyxeria asked, circling her now, each step deliberate, measured, as though orbiting something dangerous, something holy. "Do you know what it unlocks?" Eva's throat was dry, but she forced herself to speak, to meet the Countess's gaze, even if it scorched. "Memories," she said, "not all mine, not yet." Nyxeria paused behind her, so close Eva could feel the chill of her breath against her neck. "Memories are the surface," she whispered. "What you carry is not a key, it is a seal, a ward, a warning." She stepped into view again, lifting a hand to brush a strand of hair from Eva's face. The touch like ice and fire at once. "Your blood remembers what your mind cannot," she said, "and it sings." She turned then, walking toward a long, low table covered in scrolls, vials, relics, some glowing faintly, others wrapped in chains. "Long ago, when the first covenant was forged, there were 4, she continued, "for bloodlines that could unmake it, for flames that could ignite the world again." She glanced over her shoulder, eyes gleaming. "You are the last." Eva's breath caught, her heart slamming against her ribs. "What happened to the others?" she asked, already knowing, already fearing. Nyxeria turned fully, her expression unreadable, snuffed out. She said softly, "By fire, by betrayal, by time." She walked toward Eva again, her hand now holding a thin blade shaped like a thorn. "But you survived." She raised the blade not in threat but in ceremony, and pressed the tip against Eva's palm, drawing a single bead of blood that shimmered unnaturally, deep crimson veined with gold. It hovered in the air for a moment before vanishing in a spark of black flame. "You see?" Nyxeria said, almost tender, "Your blood does not lie." Eva's knees buckled and she stumbled, visions crashing through her again, fires consuming a black citadel, hands reaching for her through collapsing stone, a voice screaming her name as she fell. Only it wasn't Eva, not then, not yet. And in the center of it all, Nyxeria, unaged, untouched, a queen standing amid ruin, watching it all burn. "Why me?" Eva whispered, eyes wide, breathing ragged. "Why am I still alive?" Nyxeria cupped her face gently, her nails sharp against skin. "Because I hid you," she said, "because you were too important to lose." She leaned closer, her lips near Eva's ear. "Because they fear you more than they fear me." And with that she stepped back, clapping her hands once, and the chamber shifted, stone melting into velvet, darkness rushing in from every direction like a tide. And when it cleared, Eva was standing not in a throne room but in a chamber lit by candlelight and filled with mirrors, each one covered in cloth. "This is the veil chamber," Nyxaria said from behind her, "Here. You will see who you were." Eva turned slowly. "And if I don't want to?" she asked, "if I'd rather forget?" Nyxaria smiled, not cruelly but with an ancient sadness. "You came here," she said, "you followed the blood, the whispers, the fire, there is no forgetting any more." She gestured, and one of the mirrors uncovered itself, the cloth vanishing into smoke, the glass within rippling like water. "Step through," she said, "or step back and let the world burn." And Eva, trembling, burning, breaking and reborn all at once, took a breath and moved toward the mirror, the pendant glowing brighter with each step, the earring humming in tune, and just before her fingers touched the glass, she looked back, only to find that Nyxaria was no longer behind her, but standing within the mirror itself, her arms open, her eyes blazing, whispering her name, not Eva, but the one beneath, the one waiting to return. And when she stepped into the glass, everything shattered. Chapter 10, The Name Beneath the Name. It was not like falling and not like floating but like being pulled inside out and turned backward through a corridor of lightless time. Eva passed through the mirror with her breath caught between heartbeats, her skin prickling as reality melted off her like water, her senses dissolving and then reassembling one piece at a time, and when she emerged on the other side she did not feel the ground beneath her feet so much as she became part of it, rooted and weightless all at once, the chamber she now stood in was neither past nor present but something older, more sacred, a space carved out of memory and myth. The sky above her was a dome of shifting shadow, stars flickering like dying embers behind veils of violet mist, and beneath her were mosaics made from bone and obsidian depicting scenes she didn't yet understand, crowns shattered, wings aflame, thrones drowning in rivers of ash. And at the center of the chamber rose a monolith of polished black stone, tall as a tower and humming with quiet menace, runes pulsing along its surface like veins beneath translucent skin. Eva stepped toward it as if guided by invisible strings, her body no longer her own but something summoned home, and as she approached, the pendant around her neck grew hot, the earring sharp with soundless pressure, her breath came faster, chest rising and falling with each step that felt like it echoed across centuries, and when she placed her palm against the monolith the runes flared red gold and the chamber responded, wind swirling from nowhere, a low hum rising like a voice trying to remember a forgotten song, and suddenly her mind was not hers, her vision drowned in memory, her pulse overtaken by a heartbeat far older than she was. Images surged through her, hers and not hers, a girl on a battlefield screaming as light poured from her hands, a man with silver eyes cradling her as the sky burned behind them, a crown being placed upon her brow by fingers made of shadow and starlight, the sound of a name spoken like a vow, a name not Eva but something sharper, something radiant and feared, and she gasped as it flooded her, carving itself into the hollow behind her ribs where confusion had once lived. Aurelienne. The name throbbed through her skull like the tolling of a great bell, Aurelienne the unmade, Aurelienne the flameborn, and with it came everything, her power, her purpose, the truth the Countess had guarded for centuries, that Eva Moreau was not simply a woman with a strange bloodline but a vessel, a soul reborn, a queen who had once stood against the first covenant and paid for her defiance with the erasure of her name from the fabric of time, and now that name returned, louder, clearer, a blade drawn once more. She stumbled back from the monolith, gasping, hands glowing faintly with light that flickered like a dying star, her body vibrating with power that felt like too much and not enough. And the chamber shifted, walls pulling apart, light bleeding in from cracks in the air itself, and in that light stood a figure, tall and regal, cloaked in robes that flickered like candle smoke, a woman with silver hair braided with thorns, eyes burning gold, and a crown of broken mirrors glinting on her brow, and Eva knew her not by memory but by soul, by instinct, by fire. It was her, the first version, the original flame, the one who had fallen before Eva could rise, and she spoke without moving her mouth, her voice pressing into Eva's bones like scripture. "You are the last," she said, "the final echo of a war they never finished." Eva fell to her knees, tears streaking down her cheeks, not from fear but recognition, grief blooming in her chest like a wound reopened. "Why me?" she whispered, "why now?" And the woman knelt before her, their foreheads touching like the meeting of flame and wick, and whispered, Because the crown was never broken, only buried, and with that, Eva felt it, the shift, the choice. The quiet crumbling of the wall inside her that had kept Aurelienne locked away, and when she stood taller, stronger, eyes darker, mouth steady, and she turned to face the exit forming behind her as the chamber began to collapse, not in destruction but in completion, its purpose fulfilled, its memory spent, and when she stepped through the parting veil of light, the mirror shattered behind her into 1,000 pieces, each one reflecting not Eva's face but Aurelienne's, and somewhere deep in the heart of the court, Countess Nyxeria opened her eyes and smiled, a slow, knowing smile, and whispered into the dark, "She remembers." Chapter 11, The Echo of Crowns. The night outside the mirror was colder now, sharper, like the city itself had changed in her absence, though by the clock only hours had passed. Eva, no, Aurelienne, stood beneath the flickering gaslight of Nocturne's shadow-laced alleys, her breath curling in silvery tendrils as if even the air could feel the weight she now carried, the truth pressing against her chest like armor that didn't quite fit yet. The world looked the same, the decaying elegance of the streets, the flickering neon bleeding into puddles, the cracked windows and crumbling rooftops, but she saw it all differently now, saw the glyphs etched into stone beneath grime, the sigils carved into gutters, the layers of spellcraft hiding in plain sight, runes that shielded, marked, warded and watched, her vision sharper, deeper, revealing the unseen with every glance, and beneath it all she heard a song, a melody rising from the bones of the city, faint but relentless. The heartbeat of something ancient calling her forward, and she followed it, drawn through alleys and side streets until she reached the cathedral again, only this time she did not knock, did not wait, she pressed her hand against the rusted iron gate and it melted away like wax beneath flame, welcoming her with the reverence of an heir returned. Inside, the air was thick with incense and thyme, and at the altar stood Dorian, still as stone, his coat draped across the back of a chair, his arms bare and marked with runes that glowed faintly in the candlelight. He didn't turn when she entered, didn't speak, but she knew he'd felt her, the tension in his shoulders a storm held just beneath the surface. "You knew," she said, her voice a little deeper now, shaped by memory and flame, "you knew who I was," and he finally turned, slowly, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, those dark, eternal eyes, burned with something that was not surprise, not relief, but sorrow. "I hoped," he said quietly, "I feared." And then, softer, "I waited." She stepped toward him, unsure of what she wanted to say, unsure of what part of her he saw now, the woman who had sung in smoke-filled bars or the queen who had burned for her people. "How much do you remember?" he asked, and she laughed, bitter and tired. "Too much," she said, "and not enough." He nodded as if that was the only answer he expected, then reached beneath the altar and pulled out a bundle wrapped in black cloth, placing it before her with a kind of reverence that made her throat tighten. She unwrapped it slowly, and within was a crown, not made of gold or silver, but of twisted roots and obsidian thorns, ancient and cruel, beautiful in its brutality. It pulsed with recognition, the runes along its band lighting up as her fingers brushed the surface. "You wore it," he said, "before the fall, before the betrayal," and in a flash she saw it, herself standing on a balcony above thousands, the crown upon her head, fire in her hands, a promise on her lips. And beside her, Dorian, not as he was now, but younger, raw, eyes filled with hope instead of regret. She gasped and stepped back, the memory slicing through her like a blade. "I remember you," she whispered, "you stood with me." He nodded once, his voice quiet, "I loved you," and the silence that followed was thick and fragile, like glass stretched too thin. "But I failed you," he said, his voice breaking, and she looked at him, truly looked, and saw not just a man but a soul chained by guilt, by centuries of watching, waiting, surviving while she had been forgotten, buried, reborn. "No," she said, "you didn't," and in those two words something shifted, something ancient and buried, a tether snapping back into place, a bond reforged, and the cathedral responded, the candles flaring, the runes along the walls glowing, the ground beneath them vibrating with unseen power. "They know," he said, "Nyxeria knows," and she nodded, lifting the crown in her hands, feeling its weight, its hunger, its promise. "Let them." she said, and placed it on her head, and when she did the city breathed her name, not Eva, not Aurelienne, but both, and every hidden thing in Nocturne turned its gaze to the woman who had remembered, the queen who had returned, and in the darkness beneath the vampire court, Nyxeria laughed, a soft, serpentine sound that echoed off the tomb walls and through the marrow of the dead, her lips parting around words not spoken in centuries. Then let the game begin. Chapter 12, The Court Beneath Crimson Marble. The halls of the vampire court were carved from stone older than empires, veined with crimson marble that pulsed faintly underfoot like the walls themselves breathed in blood and whispered in secrets. It was a place where light was an intruder and shadow was law, where silence was not emptiness but the collected hush of power listening, waiting, remembering, and tonight, that silence fractured as Countess Nyxeria swept through the cathedral corridors, her cloak trailing like liquid night. Her heels clicking in time with a rhythm no one else could hear. The old vampires rose as she passed, not from respect, but from conditioning, fear woven so deeply into their bones it no longer had a name. They bowed their heads as she entered the sanctum of blood, the central chamber of the inner court. A vast circular hall lit not by flame but by floating orbs of pale silver fire that hovered beneath a ceiling carved to resemble 1,000 screaming faces, each one representing a war won, a betrayal punished, a secret kept. The thrones that circled the room were carved from stone and shadow, 13 in total, one for each house of the blood pact, but only 9 were occupied tonight, for remaining empty, draped in chains and cobwebs, the sigils above them long since extinguished. Nyxeria took her place at the center, not seated but standing, her gaze sweeping over the council like a blade drawn slowly across skin. "The girl remembers," she said, and though her voice was soft, it carried through the chamber like thunder beneath a shroud. The council stirred, murmurs rising like smoke, some shocked, others skeptical, one or two smiling thinly as if this had been expected all along. "Impossible," hissed Lord Mayron of House Vire, his eyes sunken, lips stained with old blood. Her line was broken, the blood diluted, her name was buried. Nyxeria interrupted, her tone sharp enough to slice bone. "But the fire remains, it always does." She turned slowly, letting the moment stretch, letting the weight of her words settle into the marble. Aurelienne walks again. Gasps rippled like wind through leaves, not just at the name but at the weight it carried, the history it invoked. Aurelienne, the last queen before the rise of the Covenant, the flame that defied the thrones, the one who nearly ended them all, the one whose death birthed the blood laws that now bound them. "This is blasphemy," snarled Lady Asera, her voice trembling with centuries of spite. "If she returns, she must be unmade before the bloodlines fracture again." Nyxeria raised a hand and the room fell silent once more. "We tried that once," she said, her expression unreadable, "and look what it bought us: rebellion, war, exile, and silence." She walked slowly toward the center of the floor, her heels clicking on the sigil-etched stone, the light from the floating orbs casting long shadows that curled around her feet like living things. "But this time," she said, "there will be no war, no rebellion." She turned back to them, and for a moment her eyes blazed with something deeper than power, regret, perhaps, or anticipation. "This time, she will come willingly." The council erupted again, voices rising, fear and fury crackling in the air, but Nyxeria only smiled. A slow, dangerous curve of lips painted the color of dried roses. "She has already taken the first step," she said, "the crown has returned to her hand." And in a chamber deeper still, beneath even the court's buried foundations, in the chamber where blood sacrifices once opened gates and names were burned into reality with spell fire, something ancient began to stir, a low hum, a vibration like a sigh escaping the lips of something that had slept far too long. The seals that held it pulsed once, then cracked, hairline fractures that shimmered with old magic, and in her sanctum, Nyxeria felt it, her breath catching just slightly, her eyes fluttering closed, her hands twitching with memory, because she knew what this meant, knew what had begun, and she whispered it now to herself as though saying it would bind it tighter or perhaps free it sooner. "The bloodstone stirs." Behind her, Lord Vire's voice trembled. "If she awakens it, she already has." Nyxeria replied, "Not fully, not yet, but enough." Her gaze turned northward, past the stone, past the court, past the walls of Nocturne itself, toward the cathedral where she knew the girl, no, the queen, now stood, crown in hand, power returning like breath into lungs long collapsed. Soon she will come here, Nyxaria said, her voice distant, not as Eva, not as an exile, but as Aurelienne reborn, and her smile was not cruel now, not even cold, it was resigned, almost wistful, as if she had seen this before, and perhaps she had, in dreams, in prophecy, in the quiet madness that lived in the corners of all immortals who lived too long, and when she does, Nyxaria whispered, we will bow, or we will burn. Chapter 13, The Song of Ash and Ember. Eva did not sleep that night, not because she could not, but because sleep had become irrelevant. The body might ache and tremble, but the soul had grown too bright, too loud, too vast to be contained by rest. She sat in the highest tower of the old cathedral, where the wind sang through broken stained glass windows and the moonlight painted fractured stories on the stone floor. The crown rested beside her, pulsing faintly, not like a warning but like a heartbeat, a rhythm reminding her of who she had once been and who she was becoming again. Dorian stood near the doorway, watching her with eyes that no longer carried the weight of denial, but of recognition, of acceptance, of something deeper that she could not yet name. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but electric, threaded with memory and anticipation, until finally he spoke, his voice low and rough like gravel stirred beneath water. Do you feel it? And she nodded, not looking at him, eyes fixed on the horizon where the lights of Nocturne shimmered like dying stars. I feel everything, she said, the city, the court, the ground beneath us, they're all holding their breath. Dorian stepped closer, each movement deliberate, respectful, as though approaching a storm he had once helped create. They know you've awakened, he said, and they fear what comes next. Eva turned to him then, her eyes no longer wide with confusion but sharp with understanding, a queen's eyes, heavy with sorrow and fire. What comes next is war, she said, and though she didn't raise her voice, the words seemed to echo through the bones of the cathedral. Whether they raise blades or bend knees, it doesn't change what's been set in motion. Dorian looked at her for a long moment, then slowly knelt before her, not out of duty, not even out of loyalty, but out of inevitability. Then I stand with you, he said, as I did before, as I should have done to the end. And she reached out, not in forgiveness, not yet, but in recognition, her fingers brushing his cheek, remembering the man he had been, the love they had shared before the betrayal, before the fall, before the world shattered. You left me, she whispered, not accusing, just naming the truth, and he closed his eyes, the weight of centuries pressing down on his shoulders. I did, he said, and I've regretted every moment since. She didn't tell him it was all right, because it wasn't, not yet, but she let her hand linger, a promise that forgiveness was a path, not a gate, and they would walk it together if time allowed. Below them, the city stirred, the heartbeat of Nocturne now louder, faster, as if sensing the gathering storm. And far to the east, in the iron gardens of the court, the veiled statues that lined the ancient walls wept blood from their sightless eyes, a sign older than language, a prophecy beginning to unfold. The bloodstone song, once silent, now whispered through the ley lines beneath the streets, calling to every creature born of dark and flame. And they heard it, the forgotten ones, the exiled, the chained, the ones who had once called Aurelienne queen before her name was scrubbed from time. They stirred in crypts and ruins, in forests that drank moonlight and seas that hid cities drowned in shadow, and they listened, waiting for the signal that would call them home. In the cathedral, Eva stood, lifting the crown once more, not placing it upon her head, not yet, but holding it before her like a torch in the dark, and she closed her eyes, reaching inward, past the fear, past the anger, to the place where the fire lived, and there she sang, not with voice, but with soul, a song that rang out not through air but through memory, through magic, through blood. It was not a melody anyone living remembered, but those who had once heard it stirred, blinked, wept, the sound waking something deep within their ancient hearts. The song was her name, her promise, her defiance, and her return, and in the depths of the sanctum, Countess Nyxaria rose from her throne with a smile that did not touch her eyes, turning to the other lords of the court with a voice like midnight thunder. She sings, she said, and the old blood answers, and one by one the torches that lit the sanctum dimmed, replaced by a low, red glow pulsing from the walls, from the ground, from the very air, as the bloodstone began to awaken, and with it, everything they had buried.
Every story has an ending, but some mysteries live on. If you enjoyed this tale, don't let it fade into the shadows. Smash that like button and subscribe for more thrilling stories that will transport you beyond the veil of the ordinary. Subscribe to our channel and your name will appear at the beginning of our next video, where we will pleasantly thank you for your subscribing. Tap the bell icon so you never miss a journey into the unknown. Share your thoughts in the comments. What twists did you see coming? And what secrets do you think still remain? Until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and let the next story begin.